My name is Martha Guzman, and I'm from the governor's office. Is it on? A little closer. Okay. That better? No?
On? Yeah, it's on. You
Hello?
gotta get really close.
Okay. All right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Martha Guzman. I'm in the governor's office, and I'd like to welcome you all today to our first of two workshops on groundwater. As you know, this is an issue that is not new to anyone and is one of critical importance to the state. It is one that was included in the governor's budget and one that we have a fairly quick timeline on gathering information to try to make continuous progress on. This obviously is the beginning of many next steps on this. I don't think I need to, it looks like the folks in the room don't need any background on the situation that we're faced here in California. Unfortunately, there are many areas that have a situation where the groundwater is overtaxed and current practices are not sustainable. And what we've recognized both in what we've talked about in the governor's plan, the water action plan, and particularly in the governor's budget, is that one size does not fit all, and a approach in that manner will not work for the entire state. We obviously have a state with many geographical differences and many cultural differences that we want to account for a regional approach. And I just want to note that many of you know the drought has raised even broader awareness of the importance of this issue, and it has created even more immediate challenges in some areas. But this issue was put forward by the governor even prior to the drought, given its great potential to make the state more drought and climate resistant. So the resiliency of this issue is really important, not just for and unfortunately probably dealing with the issue in this current year won't be the objective of this effort, but it certainly will be to make California more resilient. Just want to note a little bit about the water action plan that the governor released earlier this year. Some of the main objectives pointed out in the plan include collecting and sharing additional groundwater data, updating California's groundwater plan, Bulletin 118, increasing groundwater recharge and storage, accelerating groundwater cleanup, and what we're here to talk about today, empowering local agencies to manage groundwater sustainably. Some areas do a fabulous job using a range of tools from full-on court adjudication to strong county, water district, or other local agency management. Others have had a harder time for a range of institutional, financial, and political reasons. And the difficulty in that is very complex, and that's, again, what we're here to talk about today. The plan put forth in these workshops is two-part. Part one is to provide local and regional agencies with the information, tools, not the workshop, excuse me, but the focus is for the first part of this plan to provide local and regional agencies with information, tools, access to funding, and authorities to sustainable managing groundwater. And secondly, when local agencies do not, the state should protect the most challenged basins until an effective local program can be established. This is what we've been commonly describing as the state backstop. While these are important actions, they're by no means is the solution. Rather, these are near-term actions that can begin to alleviate some of the current problems and to put us on a path of a more sustainable future. More importantly, they have opened a multi-stakeholder conversation whose time has come. Today's workshop is to hear your ideas and possible solutions to these two pieces. At next month's workshop, we will talk about various proposals that are taking shape with the goal of proposing any needed legislative changes in the near term. I'll just note in the agenda that after the last panel for today, we will have public comment. And we also continue to encourage you to email us at groundwater@ca.gov.ca, and also to participate in the April 16th workshop, which we hope to have a considerable amount of input prior to then so we can actually start to discuss and scope out potential solutions. I'm going to go ahead and ask my colleagues to introduce themselves, and then I'm going to come back and go over some logistics.
Good morning. I'm Gordon Burns. I'm the Undersecretary at Cal EPA.
Really have to get on.
Good morning. Can you hear me now? I'm Gordon Burns. I'm the Undersecretary at Cal EPA. Thanks you all for coming.
And I'm Janelle Beeland. I'm the Undersecretary at the Resources Agency.
And I'm Dan McManus with Department of Water Resources, our Northern Region office, sitting in for Gary until he can get here.
I'm Sandra Schubert. I'm the Undersecretary for the Department of Food and Ag.
Debbie Davis, Governor's Office of Planning and Research.
Felicia Marcus, State Water Board, and I want to acknowledge that the meeting has been noticed so that my other colleagues, we have Franz Bivey Weber, Steve Moore, and Didi Diadamo, who are here because it's so important to be listening, and we may cycle through my chair over the course of the day.
Thank you. Okay, some quick logistics. Again, the copies of the agenda are on the back table. The times on the agenda are approximate, and depending on the number of questions that we ask, the panel length may extend or contract. I'm not sure if there's any overflow in the Byron Share auditorium, but if you have any questions to ask the panel, if you're there, you must come into this room, the Coastal Hearing Room. Any of the PowerPoints that are presented today will be posted on the website. And finally, just a technical, an evacuation procedure. In the event of an emergency, please take all of your valuables, and we would have to walk down the stairs, not take the elevators, and exit over to Cesar Chavez Park. Okay? Okay, with that, I'd like to call our first panel to come to the table. And we have Tom Goring, who's the Executive Director of the Sacramento Water Forum, Grant Davis, the General Manager of the Sonoma County Water Agency, John Rossi, the General Manager of Western Municipal Water District, and Dan Wendell, Associate Director, Groundwater for the Nature Conservancy. Thank you, gentlemen.
How's that? You can hear me? So it's very uncomfortable to have my back to my esteemed colleagues. And thank you for inviting me today. So I'm going to talk about groundwater management in the Sacramento area. When Mr. Burns of Cal EPA called me and asked me to give the talk, my first response was, I'm not the right guy, because I am not a groundwater manager. My organization had some involvement in the development of groundwater plans and groundwater governance in the area, but my organization's role now is sort of stepped back. We're sort of coordination among basins, but not managing within basins. Gordon assured me that that he needed to fill several minutes of time, and he couldn't find anyone else, and so here I am. Outline, won't go over it. So I'm looking over here at the monitor. If it feels awkward, it's not. Yeah, it feels awkward. This is just a slide I use in almost every presentation I do now when I talk about my region. This is a water schematic of the Sacramento area. What you can see, excuse me, each of the approximately 20 different water providers in the region uses either groundwater, surface water, or both. Each box or oval represents one or more purveyors. A blue bar is their surface water supply. This was annual water production in circa 2007 or 2008. Green bars are groundwater. What may not be evident is that for most of the purveyors in our area, with the exception of Sac Suburban Water District, they're a box center left on the slide. Most of our districts either use surface water or groundwater, or both, but not in a redundant way. So City of Sacramento, for instance, you can see they're the biggest single group of bars. This is lower left on the slide. They have a big blue bar. About 80% of their water supply comes from surface water. They have about 20% of their water supply comes from groundwater, but they have two distinct zones. So they're not using groundwater and surface water redundantly, as opposed to Sac Suburban, center left, who has a true conjunctive use method. In drier years, they have the ability to switch to 100% groundwater. That's what they did this year. That's what they did last year. In wet years, they can use in-lieu recharge, and that approach has been very successful in rebounding a pretty serious cone of depression in the area. So there's this thing called the Water Forum Agreement. The Water Forum is a group of business interests, environmental groups, water purveyors, and public agencies. In essence, they signed a truce in local Sacramento water wars. The Water Forum Agreement is basically a series of gives and gets. Water purveyors got a commitment from the environmental community to support their continued use of surface and groundwater in the region, and to support approximately doubling their use of surface water from the American River system over a 30-year period. In return, the environmental community got a commitment to aggressive water conservation, an improved flow standard, cutbacks in surface water use in the driest of years, and to groundwater management, which is why we're here today. This is an excerpt from the Water Forum Agreement, and those are lofty words, right? Our vital resource, viability, right? So how did they make that work? Well, they also said, in addition to setting some goals for sustainability, that they would push for local governance of groundwater. And so here's sort of the status report. I have a total of 11 slides, so this is pretty quick. The first, and I think very notable thing about the Water Forum Agreement from a groundwater management standpoint, is it did establish a set of volumetric sustainability targets, metrics. I know that I understand that the work that's being done by the governor's office and the resources agencies on groundwater is searching for appropriate sustainability metrics. I want to point out that these are the metrics we've chosen for this region. I would not be I would not be so bold as to suggest that these kind of metrics would work anywhere else, and they may not even be the best metrics for here, but they are the ones that we chose. I'll also point out that, and I wasn't with the Water Forum back in 2000, back in the late 90s when they established these goals, but as I understand it, these are a mixture of science and policy. They are, for the most part, informed by technical work, but ultimately negotiated. So how are we doing for another thing that the Water Forum did was it divided Sacramento County up into 3 zones. We call them groundwater basins. Groundwater hydrologists might quibble with whether or not those are groundwater basins, but they are definitely geopolitical basins. And for each of those basins, here's a quick snapshot of the status. For the North Basin, this is the area of Sacramento County north of the American River, north of here. We've been successful, and I use the we liberally, because again, my organization was involved in developing the approach, and then we've stepped back. We've developed and adopted a groundwater management plan, and the folks there have been successful in developing a joint powers authority to actively manage their groundwater basin. I don't have a slide that shows this, but in essence, they have rebounded a 30-year downward trend in groundwater elevation, and they had a deep cone of depression, largely through in-lieu recharge in Sac Suburban Water District. They've been able to rebound that and halt the downward slide. Central Basin, south of the river and down to roughly the Cosumnes River. We call it our Central Basin. They have also established a groundwater management plan and formed a joint powers authority. They're less active than the North Basin. The North Basin, because they had a need to do pretty active management, they really jumped in. Central Basin, not quite as active. South Basin has developed a groundwater management plan. They have not seen it in their best interest to develop a local governance structure, a joint powers authority or otherwise. They do have a loose confederation of organizations who've worked on developing the plan and who are doing ongoing monitoring. Our organization has had the least amount of connection with the work down south. Down south meaning, Galt. Another thing I'll note is that within each of those zones, the most recent surveys that have been done indicate that the average annual groundwater extraction is less than these sustainable yield values. Does that mean that we're sustainable? Not necessarily. It means we've met our sustainable yield targets. Another thing to mention when I say that the North Basin is more active, one of the things that they have developed is something they call their groundwater accounting framework. They have taken each of the government or private organizations that deliver water, that deliver groundwater in that basin. They've divided up their own estimate of sustainable yield, 90,000 acre feet per year, and they've allocated it to all the members. They have discussed having a fee structure. They have discussed having tighter controls on whether or not people meet their allocated values. But right now, as a whole, they're within their target extraction amount, and so that's where they're at right now. Whether they go further, it's up to them because it's local governance. Central Basin is working on a groundwater accounting framework. They're in the process of doing technical studies to see how that's going to work. I don't think they even have a timetable right now. Final comment, in the region, groundwater sustainability is also linked to groundwater quality. We do have a handful of fairly serious contamination plumes in the region, the biggest of which, here I like the flashy, yeah. The biggest of which is the big green blob on slide right, which is the Aerojet plume. It is a vestige of the Cold War. They made rocket engines and processed rocket fuel there, and they left us a gift called perchlorate in our groundwater. All of these groundwater contamination plumes are being remediated as we speak, but some of them, like the Aerojet plume, have a remediation target measured in centuries. So it's definitely a concern. It's a concern, not just from a health standpoint, but from a water supply quantity standpoint. The cost of treatment of these contaminants at the wellhead is so high that when we reach the minimum contaminant level in any of our wells, if the plume moves further, in essence, those wells become unusable. Conclusions. We've taken a local approach. We have established some sustainability targets, volumetric sustainability targets. The extraction by most recent measurements is less than those targets. We have local governance in 2 out of 3 zones. Contamination appears to be contained, but it's elusive. Going back about 6 years ago, there were surprise measurement of perchlorate in wells where they never thought they'd see it before. So our best efforts tell us the plumes are contained, but we literally stay up late at night worrying about it. Future, are we sustainable in the county in these 3 basins? I think it depends on the pattern of development, on how much additional groundwater extraction we bring into the county, how much additional groundwater banking, in lieu recharge, active recharge we bring in, and that's our long-term picture. Do we want to go to next speaker?
Yes, please, and we'll take questions at the end of the panel.
Alrighty, good morning. I'm Grant Davis, the General Manager of the Sonoma County Water Agency, and this is quite an odd one for me. I haven't had this My board taught me never turn my back on the state. Kind of deciding what to do here. So appreciate the opportunity to share briefly some of our insights with regard to sustainable groundwater management. Sonoma County Water Agency was a special district that was created by the legislature in 1949, and our operations span 3 different counties, Marin, Mendocino, and Sonoma County, and increasingly a little bit into Napa with recycled water. In addition to our core responsibilities, which are supplying wholesale water to 600,000 customers, we also provide flood control and wastewater services. And we're the lead agency in 2 groundwater management programs in Sonoma County. We're also participating in the California Water Foundation's Groundwater Steering Committee. I've provided written remarks to be able to provide to the board members here to expedite my comments, so I'll make this within my 7 minutes. Based on our experiences, which I'll describe briefly, we believe local government actually works best with related to groundwater. And I'll focus on what we learned about sustainable groundwater management and identify 2 areas in particular where we think the state can be of help. In Sonoma County, groundwater is actually one of 2 primary sources of water for urban, rural, residential, and agricultural water uses. The other source being the surface water from the Russian River system. Groundwater also plays an important role in supporting habitat for sensitive ecosystems. And we're not unlike other coastal areas, and our groundwater basins are relatively small and geographically complex. But Sonoma County itself is a large county with 14 different distinct groundwater basins. In general, our region has experienced the impacts that Tom and others have expressed to groundwater resources, such as declining water levels and water quality impairment. And these have led, in some years, to conflict and sometimes litigation between urban, rural, agricultural, and environmental groups. However, since 2000, the Sonoma County Water Agency and the U.S. Geological Survey have collaborated in partnership to conduct a series of technical and scientific studies in 4 of the largest and most heavily populated groundwater basins. And to date, we've completed 3 of these studies and are expecting to begin the final study later this year. In 2 of the basins where we've conducted these studies, the water agencies engaged the Center for Collaborative Policy to conduct state water assessments of residents and interest groups within these basins. Primarily, 1, to gauge the level of understanding, and 2, to assess whether there is community support for some form of management. In both cases, we heard loud and clearly from the stakeholders that 1, there is a significant interest and concern about groundwater, and 2, that groundwater should be locally managed in a voluntary and collaborative manner and not driven by a regulatory process. And based on the stakeholder assessments, the Water Agency moved forward with groundwater management planning in Sonoma Valley and the Santa Rosa Plain. For Sonoma Valley, a stakeholder basin advisory plan was developed along AB 3030, SB 1938, 2007 plans, and we've been implementing that plan ever since. In the Santa Rosa Plain, we've been working with the Basin Advisory Panel since December 2012 to develop a management plan in compliance with AB 3030, and we're anticipating completion of this plan this summer. Through both processes, we've identified 7 key components for developing a program that we believe will lead to sustainable, locally controlled groundwater resources. The first component, it's a vibrant stakeholder participation process. A wide range of constituencies has become educated not only on groundwater, but water issues in general. The stakeholders include urban, rural residential businesses, municipal, environmental, tribal, and agricultural interests. And this has resulted in the groundwater management programs being community-based planning forums for actual integrated water resource management, not just groundwater management. We are now beginning to incorporate climate adaptation planning into these programs as well. In coordination with our groundwater management programs, we've been able to develop and in some cases implement conservation, stormwater recharge, recycled water, and groundwater banking projects targeted to help meet basin management objectives. Second component actually includes monitoring and modeling. In Sonoma Valley, where we once had 50 wells that were monitored, we now have 150 through voluntary programs that provide data and important trend lines for us to manage. A third component is actual commitment to groundwater protection, developing programs and educating people about the need to protect recharge areas and improve well management to ensure both quality and quantity. Fourth would be increased conservation, educating people about the need to conserve water in order to protect groundwater resources. Fifth component, increased groundwater recharge. With the support of stakeholders, we are exploring opportunities to increase recharge, including aquifer recharge, by temporarily allowing captured stormwater to percolate into the ground. Another option is groundwater banking during the winter. The sixth component we've identified is an actual increase in water reuse. In southern Sonoma Valley, there are saline intrusion issues from San Pablo Bay, and we have significantly increased the use of recycled water for both farmers and to help restore abandoned salt ponds. The final component is integrated water management. We're working closely with our contractors to encourage them to use Russian River water in rainy years when it's plentiful, thereby allowing their groundwater wells to recharge. We have a long way to go, though, to incorporate all the elements of a successful integrated management plan. The areas of concern and opportunities for the state as we see it are that despite our efforts, we have some areas where groundwater declines and resulting saline water intrusion are increasing. And with the current drought, these impacts are exacerbated. We're asking whether we need to look at other approaches to management, including land use policies and regulatory-driven approaches. We're also facing challenges in how we fund projects. We've been able to receive state funding to support some of our projects, but it takes a significant local investment to implement these programs on a continual basis. To date, most of the funding's been through water rates paid by urban water users, yet most of the groundwater users are rural, residential, and agricultural. Also, these areas where we see the most significant problems are in these non-urban areas. The urban stakeholders are expressing reluctance to continue funding groundwater management programs unless agriculture, rural, and other interest groups start to fund projects and programs. It's very difficult to get funding from these sectors because agriculture in general and rural residential are not organized or represented by a water district or a JPA, so we are dealing with a large number of independent operators. This is a big problem in terms of funding and in working with these constituencies to manage groundwater, since in total they are the largest water group. So in closing, the state could support local groundwater management by providing funding mechanisms and incentives to organize and participate in groundwater management to help alleviate these potentially divisive issues. For example, providing funding and expertise in the creation of water districts or JPAs. And lastly, the state could also help the local level by providing incentives for streamlined permitting for projects within an approved groundwater management plan. One type of project where there's a lot of community enthusiasm is for stormwater recharge projects, which is a challenging aspect to permit. I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to describe what we're doing here locally regarding sustainable groundwater management and be happy to answer questions after we're done with the panel. John?
Good morning. My name is John Rossi. I'm the General Manager of the Western Municipal Water District. And I, too, it's an interesting format, but I wanted to share a little background. Western, first, is a wholesale agency and a retail agency down in Riverside, Southern California, part of the Santa Ana watershed. We're about 500 square miles. And I've had the pleasure of working on groundwater management issues for probably the last 25 years or so, primarily through four basin management activities I wanted to mention. First of all, by way of general manager assignment, I have responsibilities as one of two water masters on the San Bernardino and Riverside groundwater basins. We're primarily looking at a reporting function and monitoring function I want to talk about a little bit more. One of five water masters on the Santa Ana River water master, about a 2,000 square mile watershed, and we account for water upstream, downstream, or upper and lower watershed. Both of these report to active court functions. And then in the Chino Basin, I served as executive director for about 3 years in the early 2000s, and am still involved through the committee. It's I would call governance on overdrive. I was kiddingly, but it's a very, very active governance structure I want to talk about for a minute. And then finally, the Santa Margarita River Water Master, which goes the river down through Camp Pendleton. Each of these groundwater entities are from active to very or extremely active. I say that because typically each of them have a monthly meeting of one or more groups, including committees from quality subsidence to boards to advisory committees. It's a very transparent, very, very active kind of functions. And when I look at the two questions asked here about what is sustainable management and how do we measure success, I think just by way of the fact that these, looking at the Chino Basin, for example, looking and talking about things that were developed from their inception of 1978 was a stipulated agreement. The parties were fighting, the groundwater levels were dropping, there was a lot of ag in our urban world for dairies and vineyards and citrus, and the water levels were dropping. But luckily, after some argument for probably a better part of a decade, the parties came together and decided they were going to ask the judge to stipulate an agreement rather than litigate through that process. And what became the Water Master was then housed within another municipal agency for about 15 years until about 1999, when the group went to the court and said, this thing isn't working very well. The Water Master, which was the board of one municipal agency, is not getting the job done. And the court said, that sounds like a problem. I'll tell you what, if you don't decide on how you want to manage yourselves collectively within, I think it was about 18-month period, I'm going to put DWR in as the Water Master. And no slight to DWR, it was motivating for some reason. The parties got together and determined and hired an engineer to come in and develop what they call the Optimum Basin Management Program, which has 9 elements and a lot of detail, but quality, quantity, so subsidence issues, looking at groundwater desalting, hydraulic control, low water quality was leaving the basin going out to the Santa Ana River, which is a source of water for Orange County downstream. That had to be dealt with. And so moving the ball forward, you see today, I would call them arguments or negotiations or debate on what we might, in some areas of the state, consider very minute levels of discussion about groundwater storage, 1,000 acre feet here on this issue, and so forth. But I bring that up because what I found in each of these 4, in my experience, each of these 4 areas, there was a hammer that came up in some place or time when the parties had reason to look more inward and say, we have a problem, we got to deal with this. And whether it's regulation, whether it's a loss of production abilities to water crops or provide municipal service, the parties found a way to get to the table and find solutions. So each of these are, again, stipulated agreements, but they have, I would suggest, in common a long-term focus. They're each looking at where are we going to be 10 years from now, 20 years from now. Because one of the things I believe that groundwater basins are most valuable in the state picture in the Water Action Plan is as a buffer. Here we are in an extremely dry situation, and they can be used in extreme ways when we know how we're going to replenish them, when we know how we're going to interact with surface water, when we have a plan, when we have financial mechanisms, who's going to pay for that? One of the biggest struggles is we now have an opportunity in a wet year to put water in the ground, but our agency, our city, our water district board has not dealt with the water budget or the water dollar issues, so we don't have funding. We need a budget for that next year. But having that long-term focus, having a plan, fighting, arm wrestling for better or for worse, having that long-term focus is something that is really now benefited these agencies. And in each of these cases, those declining water levels, just a black and white graph, have really, now are bouncing in a place that they probably should be. Still a lot of things to discuss and arm wrestle over. My final comment, I just wanted to mention, I've been really enjoyed working with peer water managers around the state, Aqua Groundwater Committee and other forums, and there's a lot of stress and a lot of worry, but I want to commend them for being willing to get out and talk about these tough issues and make some decisions and put the ball forward rather than waiting for things to come at them. So, thank you.
All right, thank you, John. My name is Dan Wendell. I'm with the Nature Conservancy. John's comments are going to play right into what I have to say, so I'll try to point that out as I go along. I was asked to address the questions of what is sustainable groundwater management and how do we measure success. Well, we've known since the 1940s that there are only 2 sources of sustainable water supply to wells. One is induced recharge from overflowing recharge areas, which are pretty rare. And the other is capture of groundwater that would have otherwise discharged to streams and lakes. This is something we know. In other words, the capture of water that goes to streams or lakes is going to result in decreased stream flow. Therefore, groundwater pumping is only truly sustainable to the degree that we accept the associated impacts to these surface water systems. Groundwater pumping is really just another way of diverting surface water. Groundwater systems are storage and conveyance systems, not new sources of water supply. California's law and regulations, however, do not recognize these physical relationships and instead allow for relatively unconstrained groundwater pumping while exercising a permit system for surface water. The results have been unsatisfactory from most all perspectives, having led to widespread lowering of water tables that has dried up shallow wells, loss of perennial flow in streams that's needed for salmon migration and riparian habitat, land subsidence, and the impairment of existing surface water rights, which I'll expand on in a minute. To manage groundwater in a sustainable fashion, every significant non-adjudicated basin in the state needs to have clearly defined limits on groundwater pumping and water level fluctuations, the stabilizations of water levels that John mentioned. This approach needs to recognize the trade-offs between groundwater pumping and surface water impacts and be arrived at in an open, collaborative, and stakeholder-driven process that accounts for the economic benefits of land cultivation, but also the economic and cultural benefits of in-stream flows for an important species of fish, the maintenance of important riparian habitat, at least in select streams, and existing surface water rights. A key measure of success in basins where groundwater levels are still near the surface will be maintenance, and I have a picture up there I'll reference in a second, will be maintenance of perennial flow in key streams and safeguard of established surface water rights. In basins, and this is most in the state that are at all used much, in basins where groundwater is already strongly decoupled from surface water systems, such as many areas in the southern San Joaquin Valley, the simple stabilization of water levels and the avoidance of additional impacts, such as land subsidence, may be the best we can hope for in the foreseeable future. Key measures of success in these cases would be groundwater level changes that average out to zero over a period of time, say 10 years. This again plays to what John was saying about water level stabilization, and this is how most adjudicated basins end up. Maintenance of a drought buffer and establishment of a factor of safety for undesirable impacts such as land subsidence. And so just briefly, it would be great to keep water levels very shallow, maintain streams, and if I was a salmon or a surface water rights holder, that's where I'd want the groundwater levels to be, very shallow. That's not what happens usually. Typically we go into these things blind. We don't understand the consequences of our actions. We draw water levels down. Finally, somebody's wells go dry, like these small wells. Somebody sues somebody else. And through some mechanism, which we're working at right now in this room, we come to some way of stabilizing water levels in the ground. And what we're asking for is to stabilize it, keep the operational water level within some reasonable bounds, et cetera. And we can talk more about this in the Q&A if you like. Now, many people automatically assume that overdrafted groundwater basins, especially where land subsidence and well failures are present, have the most complex and pressing problems and therefore require the most attention and money, but we don't agree. And I'm going to give an example of this. If we want to avoid problems in areas that are reasonably healthy today, it is imperative that we consider the overall value of the hydrologic system, both to man and to nature. Time is of the essence in these cases, since the environmental and surface water rights impacts occur very early in groundwater development, when modest water level declines of only 20 to 40 feet can result in significant depletion of stream flow and even perhaps loss of perennial flow and the impact of surface water rights. And again, you can see what I mean in this figure, where it's a very demanding challenge to keep those surface water, those groundwater levels shallow. But if you don't, you have impacts such as the Sacramento Valley. And I want to give that as an example of what happens in a system if we don't look at it when things haven't gone too bad. The Sacramento Valley still has water levels that are fairly shallow. There's numerous perennial streams and healthy ecosystems. And the basin is largely within a reasonable definition of sustainable groundwater yield. However, since the 1940s, groundwater discharge to streams in this area has decreased by about 600,000 acre-feet per year due to groundwater pumping. And it's going to decrease an additional 600,000 acre-feet per year in coming years under 2009 status quo conditions due to the time it takes effects for groundwater pumping to reach streams. It takes years to decades, our work has shown. So this represents a loss of 1.2 million acre-feet of stream flow. This is real water. This is stream flow that would have otherwise ended up in the delta. And our current estimates are that 400,000 acre-foot of this 1.2 million acre-feet per year is lost export capacity. This represents a very real decrease in the yield of the Central Valley Project and the State Water Project, especially for purveyors south of the Delta. At a time when we are trying to increase water supplies, we're actually moving in an opposite direction from the perspective of these particular areas. Successful groundwater management will require the use of robust models, most of which exist today in key basins. Informed decision-making, adaptive, flexible, inclusive management approaches that are implemented locally wherever possible, active recharge projects, and some mechanism to ensure that limits on groundwater pumping and water level fluctuations in groundwater basins are arrived at in a reasonable fashion and are properly implemented and maintained. That is, I would say, some form of bad cop. John called it a hammer, I think it was, to make sure these things really happen. And that, because these actions are commonly perceived as going against local self-interest. In other words, we're at the tragedy of the commons. So that's all I had to say.
Thank you, gentlemen. And I think now we are going to ask you to maybe turn slightly around because we're going to allow some of our agency folks to ask you some clarifying questions.
That felt a little bit like, was it What's My Line or what show?
I'll start. Question for Tom Goring. I wonder, Tom, if you feel like where Sacramento is now is maybe on a timeline similar to Mr. Rossi's description of Chino, that there were a series of the negotiations kind of took time and took some tinkering as they went, because you've got these, as you said, not necessarily scientific agreements around a safe yield or a sustainable yield, but maybe if that doesn't hold, there will be pressure points that force tinkering in that. How do you envision that coming along?
I think it's very hard to tell. I don't think we have the level of animosity and conflict over groundwater that Mr. Rossi talked about, and maybe we'll be there in the future. I'm actually really glad that Mr. Wendell didn't use the Cosumnes River as an example of the type of problem that can develop when you drop surface water supplies and disconnect a river. But that is something within our basin that I didn't talk about. It's something that we've attempted to address. So yeah, we have impacts. Whether or not we head towards adjudication, stipulated agreements, I don't see that in the foreseeable future.
I just wonder, do you feel, are there gaps in the authorities that these management entities have to actually achieve the outcome, or do you feel like the management entities that you all represent have what you need to be able to achieve the goal of sustainable groundwater management?
In my testimony, I was alluding to two features that we feel, regardless of the groundwater management entity, is going to need, and that would be the ability to better manage the resources. And in this case, the Sonoma County Water Agency does not have the authority to embark upon a regulatory approach that would charge, for instance, for groundwater supplies, both for putting water in the basin to recharge the aquifer and to extract it. In addition, we're a wholesaler, and as a wholesaling entity, though we work very closely with the county, we would need a retail entity, something that was manifested by virtue of in this case, the rural residential and agricultural communities coming together. So I could see the state assisting entities like ours in the development of partners that would be established to be the retail side, and ultimately the folks that would be self-interested in managing the groundwater resources.
It's a tough question to answer because in our case, they're all a little different. They were homegrown, right? But I think what we found is the carrot works a lot better than the stick, incentives. And so the AB 3030 and a lot of the funding that's come from propositions and other grant opportunities over the year has really moved the ball forward in different cases. And I think thinking forward, how do we find tools and incentives, and then if there's actors that don't, you know, where to go from there. But I think the first step is to find ways to help with some of the assistance. There's a lot of things that have already been done, so we don't have to recreate the wheel. There's a lot of models to follow, but how do we create incentives would be my suggestion.
I have a question for Dan. You mentioned the overall value of a basin, because I do think we have been looking at prioritization in terms of overdrafting, you know, things like that. Can you give a couple of examples of what types of indicators you're talking about that are not captured with that?
Sure. I think it would primarily be perennial streams. Do you want to maintain perennial streams outside of the streams that are part of a dammed system? That would be a key indicator. And if we maintain water level shallow enough, we can have perennial streams, which means we can have salmon migrating up them, and we can have riparian corridors. If we draw water levels down in most basins like we have, look at the San Joaquin, we strand the fish. They can't make it up. So that's a key indicator. And again, I just come back to there's other stakes in the game being water rights, which I tried to point out.
Question, that was actually a great and very informative panel. In some ways, it's too bad we can't spend all day with you, but I think each panel is going to keep opening more questions, and you got to a level of depth that we haven't seen in other workshops, which is helpful. My question is sort of an open one for all of you or any of you. I mean, some of the things that we've talked about on which there are wildly differing opinions are issues like what should the thresholds be. Obviously, is an issue of do you avoid serious overdraft of a basin, or are you trying to go for sustainable management of a basin? What should we be thinking about as we think about the state stepping in this two-part sort of support and then backstop role? And obviously we'll talk about the backstop stuff or the backup stuff specifically at the end of the day. There are also issues of governance, enforcement, finance, monitoring, which are of a piece with governance. I'm just curious for you all, particularly the water managers, having achieved some level of success in certain places, what your view is of how we should be thinking about what the state should be talking about, both in some of the barrier removal or the tool creation that you've talked about, or criteria, or any. I mean, I think the field is completely open to discussion, and I'd just like to hear a little bit more of what you think the most important things that we should, in this iteration, think about doing first.
I guess I've got the mic, Felicia, so I'll hand it down to my colleagues to the right. I think John actually probably hit it best. We're at a stage with the drought and with different groundwater basins where incentives ought to be the first approach. The state has the ability to help us come up with localized approaches that will work depending on the regions and what type of support's there. For example, we've had to invest a good deal of resources in making sure that the Center for Collaborative Policy could step in and facilitate just the basic understanding of what a groundwater basin looks like. And then more importantly, we had to partner with the U.S. Geological Survey. And Tim Parker is here in the audience who helped us do this. But these are very, very rigorous scientific studies to actually understand what the groundwater basin looks like and how complex it is and what the water's going to do. On top of that, then, you need to probably help other areas that aren't as fortunate enough to come together to bring the stakeholders together and make sure that all interests are represented. And that's sort of the very beginning stages of groundwater management. Others are more advanced than that, but I would maintain for the state really right now to incentivize those sorts of approaches to begin the basic understanding on how it's connected, and then the more complex stuff will come.
You know, kind of the 80-20 rule, we think about in a period of maybe 2 or 3 years, Basin got together down in Chino and looked at there's several core elements. Have to monitor what the production is, have to know where some of the quality issues are, need to know what the basin levels are, are they rising or falling. It doesn't take an awful long period of time to figure out, where the basin's headed. And as Grant said, you can argue about a lot of the details beyond that, but getting those basics down, I think every basin of any significant size needs to get its arms around that. As I mentioned, there's many models, many examples of groundwater management around the state that can be followed. That has to happen first, and it can happen in a fairly short period of time, and that gives you a, where's the needle pointed kind of issue, and then it's details from there.
I guess I'm actually not sure if this is on point, but I'll leave just a couple of thoughts. One is that groundwater level, well, I'll go back to something that Martha said in her opening comments. A one-size-fits-all, I think, can be really problematic because each basin is really different. We've talked a lot about groundwater level. Well, you go down to Tulare Lake where they have a confined aquifer, and there's no such thing as groundwater level. It's piezometric head. And so, you have to tailor a metric to the specific example. And the final thing I'll mention, just in terms of our future of management in this area, because we have had arguably some really nice success in local management. That's great. But we do have a tendency to pretend that each of those three basins is an independent entity, completely disconnected from the neighbor, which we know is not the case. And so there's a whole nother level of interbasin management that is in our future, I think. And we've been busy concentrating, and I use the we very loosely. Folks in this, groundwater managers in this region have been really busy trying to do things in each one of those little jurisdictions, but each of them does influence the other. So there's sort of a more global conversation to be had.
Thank you all very much for being here. It was an interesting panel. So we've talked about, or you've talked about a lot of different things that the state could do. And you talk about the need for data. Can the state help you with data? And if so, how can we help?
Collecting the data, in a lot of cases, it's not a real extreme amount. It's not, and there's databases, there's models available, that kind of thing. So for those that are not collecting data, again, some financial incentives to be able to put some of that together. I'm not sure how big of how big an issue that is to begin with.
I would say there is one aspect to be mindful of. The state can be very helpful in so many ways. Perhaps this is the 20 piece that John was talking about, that the hammer or the regulatory side, because that's there, it has tremendous ability to bring people together, but it also can be a hindrance in some ways, and that is with regard to getting voluntary measurement to occur in the first place. As I mentioned, in Sonoma Valley, for 5 years we've been working on a plan, and we started out with 50